When my father raised his glass at dinner, he didn't toast me. He toasted my brother. To Tyler, he said, lifting the wine until it caught the chandelier light. The first real warrior in this family. The table laughed. My mother laughed. I sat there in my own kitchen chair, in the house I grew up in, and watched the two people who raised me erase 20 years of my life in a single sentence. They didn't know that 3 weeks earlier I had signed off on an operation that brought 43 soldiers home alive. They didn't know my name was still classified in 4 different after-action reports, buried under a security clearance neither of them had ever bothered to ask about. They only knew that I worked in intelligence, which to my father meant a desk, a coffee mug, and nothing worth toasting. That night, something in me didn't break. It just finally stopped waiting. My name is Reagan Cole. This is the story of how my own family looked straight through me for 30 years, until a Navy admiral stood in front of a stadium full of strangers and called me by my rank, before my own father ever did. The smell of roasted chicken hung warm in the air. Candlelight slid across the good silverware, the set my mother only brought out for Tyler. From the outside, we probably looked like a postcard family. Father at the head of the table, mother pouring wine, 2 grown children home for the weekend, framed photographs of a happy Virginia household lining the hallway behind us. My father spoke first, the way he always did. Tyler ships out to Bud S. selection in 6 weeks, he said, and his voice had a pride in it I hadn't heard directed at me since I was maybe 7 years old. The Cole name's finally getting back into the water. Navy men all the way down, that's where the real ones come from. 22 years I served, he added, mostly to Tyler, though we'd all heard the story 100 times. Master Chief by the time I hung it up, ran logistics for half the Atlantic Fleet at one point or another. But nobody remembers a Master Chief. They remember the men who jump out of helicopters. My mother's laugh followed like a rehearsed cue. She filled Tyler's glass to the rim, then turned to me and poured mine only halfway. You shouldn't drink too much, sweetheart, she said. Don't you have work Monday? I just got back from overseas, I said quietly. Oh, vacation? She asked, already looking back at Tyler. I didn't correct her. None of them knew where I'd actually been or who I'd carried out of that building 3 weeks earlier, or what the inside of a classified briefing room smelled like at 4 in the morning when the numbers finally added up. My father steered the conversation back to safer ground. Tyler's going to be a SEAL. That's a man's work. That's blood and grit. Then, almost as an afterthought, the way you'd mention the weather, Reagan's in the service too. Intelligence, though, more the desk kind. Paperwork doesn't really count. My fork slipped from my hand and clinked against the plate. I let the silence sit there and pretended not to hear the edge under his voice. 34 years old, and I still felt it land the same way it had at 16, the same old bruise pressed on in exactly the same place. My mother tried to soften it the way she always did, with a compliment shaped like a dismissal. You've always been so strong, honey, you don't need anybody's approval. If only she knew how lonely strength gets when it's the only thing anyone ever hands you. I looked at the empty space across the table where recognition should have been sitting, and I finished my wine in one slow swallow. Tyler, to his credit, tried. So what's it actually like, Reg? The intelligence side. I never really get a straight answer out of you. Mostly reading things other people don't want read, I said, and knowing which parts I'm allowed to repeat. Sounds boring, my father said, not unkindly, just certain, the way he was certain about most things. No offense, I just mean Tyler's about to jump out of helicopters into open water in the middle of the night. That's a different animal. It is, I agreed, because arguing with him had never once changed his mind, only tired me out faster than the work itself did. My mother reached over and patted my hand like she was closing a cabinet door. You've got your own kind of important, sweetheart. Every family needs one steady one and one adventurous one. I wanted to tell her that the steady one had spent 3 weeks eating cold rations in a windowless room, piecing together a rescue route out of satellite feeds and radio fragments while 43 lives hung on whether I got the math right. I wanted to tell her that steady and dangerous were not opposites. Instead, I just nodded and reached for the breadbasket, because some fights aren't worth losing at your own dinner table. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the house had gone quiet upstairs, I stopped by my old bedroom. Dust had settled on a framed photo on the desk, me at 22, in dress gray, the day I graduated West Point. I wiped the glass clean with my sleeve and looked at the young woman staring back at me. I wasn't invisible. They had just never wanted to look. I sat on the edge of the old twin bed for a long while, running my thumb along the frame's edge. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear Tyler and my father still talking, low and easy, the kind of conversation that had never once included me. I didn't resent Tyler for it. He hadn't asked to be the son my father always wanted. He was just standing in the only spotlight our house had ever bothered to install. I thought about calling Priya, the way I sometimes did after a hard week, just to hear someone talk about the work like it mattered. It was almost midnight where she was stationed, though, so I let the phone stay dark on the nightstand and lay back against pillows that still smelled faintly like the fabric softener my mother had used since I was a teenager. Some things about this house never changed. The ceiling had the same water stain shaped like Florida. The window still stuck a half-inch before it would slide open. I used to lie in this exact spot and plan my whole future as an escape route, a place I could go where the things I did would finally be allowed to matter out loud. I had built that place. I had earned rank in it, bled a little for it, given up birthdays and holidays and the easy parts of being young for it. And I had still driven 3 hours home every few months to sit at a table where none of it counted for anything at all. Somewhere in the last few years, I had stopped expecting that to change. I told myself that was maturity. Looking back on it now, I think it was just exhaustion, wearing maturity's clothes. The next morning I drove past rows of gold-leafed trees, the kind of quiet that makes you forget how loud silence can actually be. The radio was running a segment about disaster relief overseas, a mission I had helped coordinate the intelligence picture for. They mentioned the unit, they mentioned the outcome, they never once said my name. I let out a short, humorless laugh. That part never changed. I remembered being 18, holding my West Point acceptance letter in both hands, and my father telling me it was a school for men who wanted to prove something. He never came to graduation. 4 years later, when I deployed for the first time, my mother sent exactly one text message: "Be careful. Come home soon. Don't do anything dangerous. Not I'm proud of you. Just don't make waves." I could still see my father's face the day the acceptance letter arrived. Still feel the particular kind of quiet that fell over the kitchen when I read it out loud. He'd looked at the envelope, then at me, then back at the envelope, like he was hoping it might rearrange itself into an offer from the Naval Academy instead. West Point, he'd finally said. That's the Army school. Not a question, almost an accusation. He'd served under the flag his whole life, and somewhere along the way that flag had narrowed, in his mind, down to one single branch, one single kind of uniform, one single definition of what coal was supposed to mean. My mother had tried to celebrate for both of them, clapping her hands together too brightly, too fast. "Well, isn't that something?" she'd said, and then changed the subject to what we were having for dinner, and that had been the entire conversation. No one asked what I wanted to study. No one asked how I felt standing at the edge of the rest of my life. I packed my own bags for Beast Barracks that August, and my father found an excuse to be at work the morning I left. My hands tightened on the wheel as I thought about the last real conversation I'd had with someone who actually saw me, 6 years ago, half a world away, standing in a dust-choked forward operating base while Rear Admiral James Holt pinned a bronze star to my chest. Holt commanded a Joint Special Operations Task Force back then, one of the rare commands where Army intelligence officers like me worked side by side with Navy Special Warfare teams, each of us filling in the gaps the other couldn't reach alone. He'd told me I was the sharpest intelligence officer he'd ever worked with, and wiser than most, because I knew exactly when to stay quiet. So, I did. For 6 more years. That silence wasn't just personality, it was policy. The day I signed on to that task force, a security officer had sat across a metal table from me and explained in flat procedural language exactly what I could and couldn't say to anyone outside a short list of cleared names. Not my unit, not my deployment location, not even the general shape of what I did most days. Not even family, he'd said, tapping the form twice for emphasis. Especially not family until it's declassified or you're reassigned. I signed it without hesitating. I didn't yet understand what 6 years of silence would cost me at my own dinner table. When I got home that afternoon, there was a cream-colored envelope waiting in my mailbox. An invitation to Tyler's Bed-S graduation ceremony at Naval Base Coronado. The name of the presiding officer stopped me cold. Rear Admiral James A. Holt, United States Navy. I stood in my driveway with the paper trembling slightly in my hands, not sure if I wanted him to recognize me or not. That night, I requested 3 days of leave. Destination, San Diego. The night before my flight, I laid my service uniform out across the bed, each ribbon catching the lamplight like a memory I'd rather have kept folded away. On the desk beside it sat a photograph from 6 years back, me and 11 exhausted soldiers, all of us covered in dust, none of us smiling, all of us alive. I turned the frame face down. My phone buzzed. Commander Diaz, my adjutant, calling to confirm travel. Colonel, Admiral Holt's office reached out. He asked if you'd be attending Coronado. Tell him I'll be there. Off duty. Off duty in dress blues, or off duty in a sundress pretending you don't outrank half the flag officers on that stage? Diaz asked, and I could hear the smile in it. Haven't decided yet. When the call ended, a text came in from my mother. Bring something light, nothing formal. It's just a Navy thing. I almost laughed out loud. If she only knew what formal meant where I came from. Right behind it, an email alert lit up my screen. A note from the base public affairs office. Press may be in attendance at this year's ceremony. Distinguished guests are asked to confirm attire in advance for the program. If I wore the uniform, my rank wouldn't stay quiet much longer. I stood in front of the mirror with the jacket held against my chest, and the woman looking back at me didn't look afraid. She looked tired of disappearing. 2 suitcases sat open on the bed, one packed with civilian clothes, one with dress blues and full decorations. 2 lives, 1 truth. I closed the second case with a soft metallic click, the sound of a decision I couldn't take back. Tomorrow, I would board a flight to San Diego. Not as the daughter they quietly filed away, as the officer they had never once bothered to see. The sun over Coronado hit like something solid, flags snapping hard against the wind, while families packed the bleachers in rows of white and navy blue. I walked in beside my parents and Tyler, a plain gray civilian jacket zipped over my uniform against the morning chill, the collar pulled up just enough to keep the insignia hidden a little while longer. My mother leaned toward a woman she'd just met, 2 rows down. My daughter works over at the Pentagon, desk job mostly, almost ready to think about retiring. The woman nodded politely. I just said, lots of paperwork, and let it go. Near the entry gate, a young lieutenant in dress whites was checking credentials. He glanced at my ID, then straightened his spine like someone had pulled a string through it. Good morning, Colonel. My father's head snapped around. What did he just call you? Probably a mix-up, I said and kept walking. But my pulse was already climbing. He recognized me, I thought. Someone out here still remembers. We found our seats. Rows of SEAL candidates stood at rigid attention on the field below, sun glaring off their white uniforms, trident pins waiting to be earned in a few hours. My mother kept fussing with her program, pointing out Tyler's name printed in the graduating class list. My father sat up a little straighter than usual, the posture of a man remembering his own graduation day decades earlier. You know, he said to me, unprompted, still watching the field. I stood exactly where those boys are standing, 40 years ago next spring. Different uniform, different war waiting for us, but the same knee-shaking feeling right before they call your name. He paused, and for a second, I thought he might actually ask me something real. You ever get that? Nerves before something big? Every time, I said. Does it matter how many times you've done it? He nodded slowly, like that answer surprised him. Didn't figure a desk came with nerves. It's not really a desk came with nerves. It's not really a desk, Dad. I kept my eyes on the field, but we can talk about that another time. He let it go the way he always did and turned back to the program in his lap. I told myself it didn't sting the way it used to. I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Admiral Holt stepped up to the podium, and for one long second his gaze swept the crowd and landed on me. Recognition flickered across his face after 6 years. I watched it settle. He began his remarks the way every commanding officer does. Honor, discipline, the weight of the trident these young men were about to earn. Traditional. Measured. Exactly as it should be. He spoke about sacrifice, about the families in the stands who had waited through months of silence and worry, about the standard the Navy asked these candidates to hold themselves to for the rest of their careers. Then, near the close of the ceremony, the announcer's voice carried across the field. At this time, we'd like to recognize distinguished guests joining us today. Admiral Holt looked down at his card, then looked back up, straight at our section. Among those honoring us this morning is Colonel Reagan Cole, United States Army, an intelligence officer who 6 years ago served alongside this command and coordinated the operation that recovered 43 American and Allied service members from hostile territory. Colonel, would you please stand? The world went very still. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's jaw locked so hard I heard his teeth click. I stood. I unzipped the gray jacket and let it fall back off my shoulders, and the silver eagle on my collar caught the California sun. My father, 22 years a Navy Master Chief before he retired, knew exactly what that insignia meant the instant he saw it. A colonel. A full bird. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. I watched his hand find the arm of the bleacher seat and grip it. The entire field rose to its feet, saluting. Down among the graduates, Tyler lifted his hand and gave me the first salute he had ever given me in his life. When the applause finally faded, I looked at my family and thought, I never hid from you. You just never looked. Afterward, the sea wind felt heavier somehow. My mother pushed through the crowd toward me, eyes wet. Why didn't you ever tell us? I tried, I said. Every time, somebody changed the subject. My father's voice came out unsteady. You're really a colonel? Since when? Since before Tyler enlisted, I said. I can't talk about most of what I do or where I've been. There's a reason for that, and it's a legal one, not a personal one. It's not about you. He looked down at his own hands, the ones that had once worked cargo manifests and fuel logs for an entire fleet. I always figured if you were doing something that mattered, somebody would have told me. You never asked, I said, not cruelly, just true. Tyler came up beside them, eyes bright, still catching his breath from the ceremony. The operation the Admiral mentioned, we studied a version of it in training, the parts that weren't sealed. Nobody told us the officer who ran it was my sister. You're the reason half my class wanted this job, and you didn't even know it. I managed a small real smile. Then earn it your own way, not mine. A reporter from the base paper caught us on the way out, notepad in hand. Colonel, would you be willing to comment for tomorrow's edition? Off the record, congratulations to every candidate out there today, I said. On the record, no comment. She smiled like she'd expected that answer and let us pass. By that evening, a photo of Admiral Holt saluting me had already made its way through half of Naval Special Warfare Command's internal channels. My inbox filled with messages I didn't have time to answer. My parents drove back to their hotel in total silence, my mother still clutching the ceremony program like it might explain something if she stared at it long enough. That night, Tyler called. They're stunned, Reg. I think they're starting to actually see you. Good, I said. Let them see it from where they're standing for once. Later that night, back at the hotel, there was a knock on my door. My father stood in the hallway in a plain t-shirt and pajama pants, looking older and smaller than he had at the ceremony that morning, all the polish of the day worn off him. Can I come in for a minute? Your mother's asleep. I couldn't sleep. I stepped aside and let him in. He sat on the edge of the small hotel armchair, elbows on his knees, staring at the carpet for a long moment before he spoke. 43 people, he said finally. That's what the Admiral said, 43. That's right. I spent 22 years in the Navy and I don't think I can point to a single number like that. Fuel manifests, supply chains. Important, sure, in the way that plumbing is important. Nobody thinks about it until it stops working. He rubbed a hand over his face. And I sat at your table for years telling you paperwork doesn't count. Do you have any idea how that sits with me right now? I have some idea, I said, not unkindly. I wasn't trying to be cruel, he said. I want you to know that. I think I was scared if I really let myself sit with it. Scared that if I admitted my daughter had gone somewhere braver than I ever did, I'd have to admit my own 22 years weren't the whole mountain I'd built them up to be in my head. That's not your fault. That's mine. I just want you to know I see the shape of it now, even if I couldn't back then. I hadn't expected that particular honesty. Not that night, not so soon after the ceremony, while the shock of it was probably still settling into all of us. Thank you for saying that, I told him. I mean it. That's more than I expected tonight. He nodded, stood, and paused at the door. For what it's worth, and I know it doesn't erase anything, I am proud of you. I think I always was, somewhere underneath all the noise I made about your brother. I just never learned how to say it out loud until a man in a white uniform said it for me. He gave a short, embarrassed, almost laugh. Pathetic, maybe, that it took that. Not pathetic, I said. Late, there's a difference. He nodded once more and let himself out, and I sat alone in the quiet hotel room for a long while afterward, turning that conversation over like a coin. I wasn't sure yet whether to spend. The next morning, an operational alert came through, severe flooding along the Gulf Coast, and my task force was being activated to support relief coordination. I looked down at the Silver Eagle sitting on my desk and thought for years I'd wanted their eyes on me. Now that I finally had them, I wasn't sure my family was ready for what the light would show. A week after Coronado, the Pentagon felt colder than usual. Whispers followed me down the corridors, part respect, part curiosity, the kind of attention I'd spent a career learning to avoid. Commander Diaz caught up with me outside the briefing room. "Colonel, that clip from Coronado's everywhere. People are talking. Then we work harder," I said and kept walking. My inbox was a flood of congratulations from people I hadn't spoken to in years, old classmates, a former battalion commander, even a journalist requesting an interview I had no intention of granting. A national outlet ran a short piece the following Tuesday, built almost entirely from the Coronado footage and whatever public records they could piece together, since I'd declined every request for comment. The headline called me "The General Her Own Family Never Saw," which struck close enough to the truth that I couldn't even be angry about the theatrics. Public Affairs asked, gently but repeatedly, whether I'd reconsider a formal interview, framing it as an opportunity to inspire other women in uniform who felt similarly overlooked. I understood the value of that. I also understood that the moment I turned my family's silence into a media narrative, I would lose whatever chance existed of ever having a real conversation with them instead of a performed one. "Respectfully decline," I told the public affairs officer for what felt like the 5th time that week. "If it comes up again, tell them the story isn't finished yet, and I'm not interested in publishing the middle of it." She looked at me for a moment like she wanted to argue, then nodded and let it go. Buried in the middle of my inbox that same week was a single message from my mother. "We're sorry. We just didn't understand." I read it once, then I closed it without replying. Some apologies need time to earn their answer. That afternoon, security called up from the lobby. "Colonel, there are 2 civilians here asking for you. They say they're your parents." I looked out the window at rain streaking down the glass. "Tell them Colonel Cole is in a closed briefing. I can't step out right now." I watched from 4 floors up as they were escorted back toward the visitor entrance. My mother turned once, clutching a small picture frame against her chest. Something in me ached at the sight of it. I didn't move. A few days after that, a piece ran in the Army's own service newspaper, the kind of publication nobody outside the community ever reads but everybody inside it does. A reporter had gone looking for context on the viral clip from Coronado, and someone had pointed her toward Priya Nakamura, who'd served under my command during the operation and had since been cleared to speak about the declassified portions of it. Priya sent me the link before it even published. "Figured you'd want a heads up, ma'am." I kept it to what's approved. "Didn't say anything you wouldn't want said." The article was careful, measured, exactly the way you'd expect from someone who'd spent years learning what could and couldn't leave a briefing room. Priya was quoted describing an officer who worked 18-hour shifts without complaint, who insisted every name on the extraction list get equal priority regardless of rank, and who never once mentioned the operation again after it ended. She didn't glorify it. She didn't need to. The plain facts did the work themselves, and for the first time, there was a name attached to them that wasn't classified and a witness who wasn't family and had no reason to exaggerate. My mother read that article 3 times according to Tyler. It was one thing to hear it from a daughter who'd spent 30 years learning to keep her mouth shut. It was another to read it from a soldier who had no obligation to say a kind word about anyone and said one anyway. That night, Tyler called again. "They're falling apart a little, Reeg. Dad's been reading everything he can find about Army ranks and command structure online. He wants to understand what you actually do, as much as you're allowed to tell him anyway. He asked me last night what the difference was between a colonel and a general, like it actually mattered to him for the first time in his life." I didn't answer right away. "Tell him I'll explain what I can," I finally said, "when I'm ready, not before." A week after that, my father called me directly for the first time in longer than I could remember. Not through Tyler, not through my mother. Just his own number lighting up my screen at 7 in the evening. I looked it up, he said without any preamble, the way he always launched into things. Colonel to Brigadier General, that's the one where you get the star, right? I want to make sure I'm saying it right if anybody asks me. That's right, I said carefully, unsure yet what kind of conversation this was going to be. And Master Chief was as far as I ever got. Top of the enlisted side, never crossed over. He was quiet for a second. I used to tell myself that didn't bother me. Guess it bothered me enough that I went looking for it in you, without ever really admitting that's what I was doing. I didn't say anything right away, giving him room to keep going if he wanted to. I'm not asking you to explain the parts you can't explain, he continued. I just want you to know I'm trying to understand the parts I'm allowed to. That's all. I know it's late. I'm doing it anyway. That's not late, Dad, I said. That's exactly on time. It's the first time you've asked. We talked for almost 40 minutes after that, not about the classified parts, not about the things I still couldn't say, but about the shape of a career he never bothered to ask about before, and for once, he just listened. The Gulf Coast call came in at 3 in the morning, the kind of alert that didn't wait for anyone's schedule. A tropical system had stalled over the coastline for nearly 2 full days, and entire towns were reporting water levels no one had planned evacuation routes for. My task force was activated to support the joint response, feeding real-time satellite and ground sensor data to the agencies actually moving boats and helicopters through the flooded streets. For 3 weeks, I lived out of a windowless operations center that smelled like burnt coffee and cold pizza, watching a wall of screens track water levels against a shrinking list of coordinates where people were still trapped. I learned the names of towns I'd never heard of before that week and would never forget after it. I learned the sound Commander Diaz's voice made at 4 in the morning when a rescue boat found a family alive that we'd almost written off as unreachable and the different. Heavier silence that followed when a coordinate on our board simply stopped answering. Somewhere in the second week, a young Coast Guard petty officer working the console beside me admitted she hadn't slept in over 30 hours. I sent her to the cot room myself and finished her shift alongside my own, because the numbers didn't care how tired either of us was, and neither did the families waiting on the other end of them. By the time the water finally receded, our task force had helped route rescue teams to over 600 confirmed survivors. Nobody outside the operation would ever know most of their names. I knew every one of them because I'd watched each coordinate turn from red to green on that screen, one at a time, for 3 straight weeks. 2 months later, after the Gulf Coast relief operation wrapped, Commander Diaz met me on the tarmac as I stepped off the transport, exhausted, smelling like jet fuel and floodwater. You helped save a lot of people out there, Colonel. We saved understanding, mostly, I said. The rest was logistics. That night, a letter was waiting on my desk. Outstanding leadership under sustained operational stress. Recommendation, promotion to Brigadier General. I read it twice, then set it down carefully, like it might still change its mind. Titles don't save anyone. But sometimes they're enough to save what's left of a family's faith. 3 months after the promotion came through, I asked Commander Diaz to arrange a meeting, not at my office and not at my parents' house, a conference room on the 4th floor, neutral ground. No family photos on the wall, no comfortable furniture, nothing but a long table and honest light. I stood at the window for a few minutes before they arrived, watching traffic crawl along the parkway below, rehearsing nothing. I had decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to script this conversation. Whatever came out would have to be true, or it wouldn't be worth saying. When the door opened, my parents looked smaller than I remember them, almost swallowed by the fluorescent brightness. Tyler walked in behind them, cap in his hands, his face unreadable. For 10 full seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound was the wall clock, slicing the silence into pieces. My father broke it first. "We didn't know," he said. "We didn't understand what you were carrying." "I never hid it," I said quietly. "You just never wanted to see it." My mother's voice cracked. "We're proud of you, Reagan, truly." "No, Mom." I kept my voice level, not cruel, just done pretending. "You're ashamed. Pride belongs to people who paid attention. For 30 years, you didn't." Her tears came fast after that, and for once, my father didn't try to smooth it over. He just took her hand. "I want to tell you why," my mother said once she'd steadied her voice enough to speak. "It's not a good reason, I know that. But every time you deployed, I used to lie awake trying to imagine where you were, and it terrified me so completely that I stopped letting myself picture it. Not asking felt like the only way I could function. If I didn't ask what you did, I didn't have to imagine you doing it. I told myself I was protecting my own heart. I never once stopped to think about what that silence was doing to yours. That's not an excuse, Reagan. It's just the truth of it, and I owe you the truth as much as your father does. I sat with that for a moment. It didn't erase 30 years, but it was the first honest reason either of them had ever given me, and honesty, I was starting to understand, mattered more to me than apology ever could. I spent my whole career thinking rank was something you could see from across a room, my father said slowly, staring at the table instead of at me. Master Chief, I was 22 years. Nobody ever saluted me on the street, nobody ever put my name in a newspaper. I used to tell myself that didn't matter, that the work was the point. And then I turned around and did to you exactly what people used to do to me, made it about the uniform's flash instead of the work underneath it. He cleared his throat hard, like the words had caught somewhere on the way out. I'm sorry, Reagan, that's not an excuse, it's the truth of it. I hadn't expected that, not the shape of it anyway. Tyler stepped forward and set his sealed trident cap gently on the table between us like an offering. I didn't understand what real service looked like until I watched that field stand up for you. You didn't need a trident or a title to earn that. You already had it. I need you to know something too, he added, quieter now. Growing up, I always felt like I had to be the loud one, the one who filled up the room, because you never seemed to need anything from Mom and Dad. I thought that meant you were fine. I never once considered that maybe you'd just given up asking. He turned his cap over in his hands. I'm sorry I let you carry that alone. I was your little brother. I should have noticed sooner. That landed somewhere I hadn't expected it to. I'd spent so many years assuming Tyler was simply oblivious, riding the wave of attention our parents kept pointed at him without ever glancing back to see who wasn't standing in it. Hearing him name it himself, unprompted, meant more than I knew how to say out loud. I nodded slowly. Nobody in this family ever taught us how to love each other the right way, Tyler. We're all still learning it late. My father reached into a worn canvas bag and pulled out a yellowed envelope, its edges soft from age. We found this in the basement, going through old boxes. It's the letter you wrote us your first deployment. We never opened it until last month. His voice cracked down the middle. You don't have to forgive us. I just need you to know I finally understand. I don't need an apology, I said. I need you to stop measuring me against Tyler. He's not my replacement, and I was never his shadow. We were never supposed to be standing in the same spotlight. The overhead light caught the surface of the table, and for a moment the four of us sat there in a strange, clean clarity, like a photograph finally coming into focus. The quiet that followed didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like something closer to peace. I waited 30 years for a conversation like this, I said. I wanted it here, in a room with no comfort in it, because this is where I learned to stand up straight without anybody standing behind me. As they got up to leave, my mother placed a small frame on the table. My West Point graduation photo, the glass freshly cleaned. We're hanging this one in the center of the house, she said softly, where everyone will see it first. When the door closed behind them, the room went still again. I looked down at the light catching my ribbons and thought for the first time in my life, they had actually seen me. Not with pride performed for other people. With something closer to truth. On my desk, a sealed envelope was waiting. Recommendation, promotion to Major General. I didn't even need to open it to know. 3 weeks passed before I heard anything more from home. The house I grew up in had always been loud, my father's voice carrying through the walls, my mother's soft, agreeable yeses, smoothing over every disagreement before it could breathe. That week, the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that means people have finally started listening. At my office, I pulled up a scanned copy of the letter I'd written from my first deployment, 20 years old now, the paper gone soft and yellow at the corners, my handwriting uneven from exhaustion and heat. I began to read it, not realizing that 400 miles away, my parents were sitting on their living room couch reading the very same words from the original envelope pulled out of a cardboard box in the basement. Our two voices moved across the words at the same time, mine steady, theirs breaking a little with every line. I never wanted to be called a hero, the letter began. I only wanted Dad to look at me the way he looks at a real soldier. Maybe someday he'll be proud of whoever comes after me, and I'll be proud of them too. But I hope he remembers that courage isn't only found in the field. Sometimes it's just enduring being misunderstood and choosing to serve anyway. My father stopped reading. The paper shook slightly in his hand. "I'm not the one who taught her courage," he whispered to my mother. "She's the one who taught me." My mother sat beside him with an old sewing kit balanced on her lap, unfolding a faded American flag that had hung in our front hallway since the day my father retired from the Navy. The edges were frayed, the colors dulled by decades of sun through the window glass. She threaded a needle and began mending the tears in it, one careful stitch at a time. "Do you remember the day you brought this home?" she asked him quietly. "Like it was yesterday," he said. "Retirement ceremony out at Norfolk. 22 years, and they hand you a flag and a handshake and expect that to sum the whole thing up. I remember standing there thinking, is this it? Is this what it all comes down to? A folded piece of fabric and a pension?" He turned the flag over gently in his hands, tracing one of the frayed edges with his thumb. "I hung it in the hallway because I didn't know what else to do with all those years. I thought hanging a flag was the same thing as living up to it. Took me a long time. Took me until a stranger stood up in a stadium and saluted my own daughter to understand those are two very different things." My mother didn't say anything to that. She just kept stitching, needle moving steady and patient through the worn fabric, mending what 40 years of sunlight through a hallway window had slowly pulled apart. When she finished, she pressed the folded flag into his hands. "We'll keep this one," she said quietly. "So we remember that honor isn't what you say out loud, it's what you take the time to fix." The old clock on their wall kept ticking. For once, the walls of that house seemed to breathe again. Back in Washington, my phone rang. The Secretary of Defense's office confirming the recommendation. "Congratulations, General Cole. The promotion to Major General has been formally approved." I let the news settle over me slowly, like a tide coming in without any hurry. "Thank you, sir," I said. "This time, my family will actually know." That night, two scenes played out at once in two different states. In Virginia, my parents hung my West Point photograph in the exact center of their living room wall, between a picture of my father in his navy dress whites and one of Tyler in his seal trident whites. In Washington, I hung a new frame behind my own desk, the four of us together from Tyler's graduation weekend, the only photograph on that wall that had all of us smiling in it. For the first time in my career, the space around that desk didn't feel lonely. The old letter sat open on the desk beside it, ink faded but still legible. It had survived deployments and silence and 30 years of being unread, and it had finally become a bridge between who I'd always been and who they'd finally chosen to see. My phone buzzed once more. Tyler's voice came through, light and steady. "They hung your picture dead center, you know, right in the middle of the wall." I let out a soft laugh. After 30 years, I guess that wall's finally breathing again. "For what it's worth," Tyler added. "Dad's been telling the neighbors his daughter's a 2-star general like it's the only sentence he knows how to say anymore." "Tell him he's allowed to say it. He earned the right to be a little insufferable about it." I turned toward the window where the sky had gone gold and blue with dusk and caught the reflection of the 2 silver stars now sitting on my shoulder. Honor isn't something you win, I thought. It's what's left standing when you finally stop fighting to prove it. 6 months into my new command, I flew back to Coronado for an unrelated briefing and found myself with an evening free. On instinct, I called Priya Nakamura, my old intelligence sergeant from 6 years back, now a sergeant first class, still stationed nearby, still one of the sharpest people I had ever worked with. We met at a small diner 2 blocks off base, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never quite stopped being lukewarm. "You look tired, ma'am," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. 2 stars doesn't buy you more sleep. Turns out it buys you more meetings about sleep. Sounds about right. We talked for a while about the old task force, about people we'd both lost touch with, about the operation that neither of us could fully discuss even now. 6 years and 1 promotion later, Priya had gotten married the year before to a Coast Guard mechanic she'd met during a joint exercise, and she showed me pictures on her phone with the same unguarded pride she used to reserve for a clean intelligence report. It struck me watching her scroll through photos of a small backyard wedding, how differently her family had apparently responded to her choices. With noise and casseroles and too many relatives crowding a folding chair reception, all of it loud with approval. I didn't say anything about the comparison out loud. I didn't need to. Some things you just carry quietly and let sit beside the good news of someone else's life. Then Priya set her coffee down and looked at me with the same steady focus she used to bring to a briefing. "Can I say something out of turn? When has that ever stopped you?" When that video from the graduation ceremony went around our old unit chat, half of us cried. She said it plainly without embarrassment, not because it was surprising, because we'd known for years what you carried and who you carried it for, and it about killed some of us that your own family had no idea. I wanted you to know that. Some of us have known exactly who you are the whole time. I didn't trust my voice for a second, so I just nodded. 15 years, I finally said. 15 years before my own family bothered to ask what I actually did for a living. You waited about 6 months before tracking me down for a reference letter. Some of us pay attention, she said, and raised her cup in a small mock toast. To the officer who never once needed the applause to know she'd earned it. I clinked my cup against hers, and for a moment the old ease of working alongside her came rushing back, familiar as a second heartbeat. That Thanksgiving, I drove home for the first time in years without rehearsing an excuse to leave early. The house smelled the way it always had this time of year, sage and roasted turkey, and the particular sweetness of my mother's cornbread, which she still made from the same recipe card. Soft at the corners from 40 years of flour-dusted hands. But something in the rhythm of the place had shifted. My father met me at the door instead of staying planted in his recliner, and when he hugged me, it lasted a beat longer than it used to. 2 stars, he said into my shoulder, like he was still getting used to the phrase. I keep telling people, and I still can't quite believe I get to say it. You'll get used to it, I said. Inside, the West Point photograph hung exactly where my mother had promised, dead center on the living room wall, flanked now by a small clipping of the newspaper article about the Gulf Coast operation, matted and framed like it belonged in a gallery instead of a hallway. Tyler had flown in between training rotations, sunburned and lean, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, dinner conversation didn't orbit entirely around him. Tell them about the flooding, Tyler said, nudging me halfway through the meal. The part you'll actually let people hear. So I did. The broad strokes, the parts that weren't sealed, the 600 people we'd helped route rescue teams to. My father set down his fork and listened all the way through without interrupting once, which might have been the single strangest and most welcome thing that happened at that table in 30 years. I used to think logistics was the boring half of the job, he said quietly when I'd finished. Guess I forgot that boring is just another word for the work nobody notices until it's missing. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand, not the closing a cabinet door squeeze from years before, but something looser, warmer. We're gonna do better at asking, she said. I can't promise we'll always know the right questions, but we're gonna keep asking them. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. My father still occasionally slipped back into old habits, still sometimes talked a little too long about Tyler's training before remembering to ask about mine. But he caught himself now, mid-sentence, and turned the conversation back around without needing to be prompted. That correction, small as it was, meant more to me than any grand apology could have. Healing, I was learning, rarely arrives all at once. Mostly it shows up in the small, repeated choice to keep trying. 3 years later, the ocean called again, this time from a joint task force posting on Okinawa in the Western Pacific. A world away from that conference room on the 4th floor and the dinner table where all of this had started. Mornings there began with light spilling over the water, soft and endless, almost forgiving. I ran along the shoreline every day. The schedule allowed the same waves rolling in with the same rhythm that had once filled a dusty forward base half a world away, and now filled the quiet space between one heartbeat and the next. In my office overlooking the water, I kept 2 photographs on the wall. One showed the relief team from the Gulf Coast operation, faces streaked with mud and exhaustion and something like victory. The other, newly framed, held my whole family, my father, my mother, Tyler, and me. For the first time, all 4 of us actually looked like we belonged in the same picture. That afternoon, a letter arrived, scanned and forwarded from my father's handwriting, the same careful block print he'd used on every birthday card I could remember. My daughter, now I understand why the waters always call to you. It doesn't need anyone's permission to be strong. It just is. Your mother mended the old flag last spring, and I finally understand why she did it. Some things you don't get to fix in one conversation. You just keep stitching. I folded the page carefully and slid it into a plain folder marked simply, Personal. Keep. Priya Nakamura, reassigned to my staff the year before, now a master sergeant, stuck her head into my office with 2 cups of coffee. You've got that look again, ma'am. What look? You've got the one where you're about to say something wise and slightly annoying. I took the coffee from her. 15 years, Priya. 15 years, Belia. 15 years before anyone in my own family bothered to ask what I did for a living. And it took an admiral standing up in front of a stadium to fix in 10 seconds what 30 years of dinners never could. That's the thing about silence, she said, leaning against the doorframe. Nobody breaks it on schedule. It just finally gets too heavy to carry anymore, and then it breaks itself. That week, a young second lieutenant named Amara Ellis had transferred into my command. Sharp, capable, and visibly bracing herself every time she walked into a room full of senior officers. The way I remembered bracing myself at her age, I caught her lingering outside my office door one afternoon, clearly working up the nerve to knock. "Come in, Lieutenant. You don't need permission to breathe out here." She sat stiffly across from my desk, eyes flicking to the photographs on the wall before she caught herself and looked back at me. "Ma'am, can I ask, does it get easier? Being taken seriously, I mean. My father was Army. He keeps introducing me to people as his daughter who's trying out the military for a few years. I've been in for 6. I recognized the shape of that sentence a little too well. It doesn't get easier because other people change their minds on a schedule that suits you, I said. It gets easier because eventually you stop needing them to change their minds at all. You do the work. You let the work be the argument. Some people will come around late. Some people won't come around until a stranger says it in front of a crowd. And a few people just never will. And you have to be able to stand up straight anyway. That's not exactly comforting, ma'am. No, I agreed. But it's true, and true is usually more useful than comforting in the long run. She left my office a little straighter than she'd walked in, and I sat there for a while afterward, thinking about how strange it was to be handing out the exact words I'd spent 30 years waiting to hear from someone else. Maybe that was the real promotion, not the stars, but the chance to become, for someone younger, the voice you never had. That evening, I stepped outside, and the wind caught my hair, warm and salted. Sunlight caught the 2 stars on my shoulder. Soon, word had it to become 3 if the Senate confirmation went the way the paperwork suggested it would. A process I now understood well enough to know it would take the better part of a year, not the sudden leap I might once have wished for. 3 quiet truths, I thought. Resilience, recognition, release. My phone buzzed. A message from Tyler, deployed somewhere out past the horizon line, his unit's exact location, as always, something neither of us would ever put in writing. "Sis, sun's coming up out here. Looks just like that morning at Coronado when you got saluted." I smiled and typed back, "You see it now, don't you?" The point was never about being seen. It's about keeping that light burning inside you, even on the days nobody's watching. "Copy that," he wrote back. "Love you, General." "Love you too, petty officer." A second message came through a minute later, this one from my father, sent at an hour that told me he hadn't been able to sleep either. "Saw the paperwork mentioned 3 stars might be coming. Your mother framed the newspaper article too, next to the West Point photo. Whole wall's getting crowded. Good crowded, I mean. I don't know how else to say that. Proud of you, Reagan. Been proud of you longer than I ever said out loud, and I'm sorry it took this long to say it right." I read it twice, standing there with the wind pulling at my sleeves, and let myself feel exactly what it was. Not everything. Not enough to make up for 30 years, but real, and finally spoken instead of assumed. I typed back a short reply because some things don't need more words than that. "Thank you, Dad. That's enough. That's more than enough." The tide rolled in below me, steady and unhurried, the way it always had been, long before anyone else had bothered to notice it was there. I used to think I needed my family to see me before I could believe I mattered. Now I know better. Light never asks anyone's permission to shine. It only asks you to keep it lit on the days when no one is watching, and especially on the days when someone finally is. I thought about Lieutenant Ellis sitting stiff in my office chair that afternoon, bracing for a world that might never fully make room for her the way it should. I thought about Priya, steady and unglamorous and entirely unbothered by who noticed her competence, because she'd decided a long time ago that her own judgment was enough. I thought about my father's voice on the phone, careful and a little embarrassed, trying out the vocabulary of a life he'd never bothered to learn before. And I thought about the girl in the dusty West Point photograph, 22 years old, who had no idea yet how long the road to being truly seen would turn out to be, or how much of the walking she'd have to do without anyone beside her. None of it had happened the way I would have designed it. If anyone had asked me in advance, I wouldn't have chosen 30 years of silence. I wouldn't have chosen the stadium and a stranger's voice to do the work my own family should have done years earlier at a dinner table. But the road had brought me here anyway, to an office over the Pacific, 2 stars on my shoulder, and a third one waiting somewhere in the paperwork, a family finally learning the right questions to ask, and a young lieutenant down the hall who might someday hand these same words to someone even younger than herself. The waves answered with one long, even breath, and then for a while, everything went still.